The house had always been more than just a place to live. For the homeowner, it was the product of years of saving, planning, and dreaming. The white siding shone brightly in the sunlight. The flower beds bloomed with carefully chosen colors each spring, and the backyard had been transformed into a private escape. Yet despite the pride and effort poured into the property, a shadow lingered over every decision: the Homeowners Association. At first, the HOA seemed harmless, presenting itself as an organization that simply wanted to maintain order and uphold neighborhood standards. But behind the neatly printed newsletters and the forced smiles at meetings, there existed a deep hunger for control. The board members, especially the president, enjoyed throwing their weight around. Small infractions often turned into drawn-out disputes. A misplaced garbage can, a mailbox painted a shade too dark, or grass growing a little too high could spark warnings and penalties. For months, the homeowner watched quietly as neighbors struggled under the HOA's arbitrary rules. Some gave in, paying fees they barely understood. Others moved away, unwilling to fight a constant battle. The board thrived on this fear and compliance. It was their greatest weapon. Then came the day the homeowner's turn arrived. It started with a letter in the mailbox, a carefully worded notice accusing them of violating neighborhood aesthetics. The reason? A simple shed in the backyard, built to store tools and gardening supplies. The structure was clean, painted to match the house, and placed discreetly behind a row of hedges. Yet, according to the HOA, it was a structural violation that disrupted the visual harmony of the community. The first letter demanded removal of the shed within 2 weeks, or face a fine of $500 per day until compliance was achieved. At first, the homeowner laughed at the absurdity. A shed, hidden from the street, harming no one, was hardly grounds for such a demand. But the HOA was serious. Another letter arrived days later, this time bolder, stating that fines had already begun accruing. The figure was staggering. In less than a week, the supposed debt reached several $1,000s. Each day, the amount grew like a spreading fire, threatening to consume savings and stability. Neighbors whispered about it, some sympathetic, others fearful that siding with the homeowner would draw unwanted attention to their own properties. The HOA board, however, seemed to relish the spectacle, holding themselves with a smugness that came from years of unchecked power. But unlike others who had caved to their demands, the homeowner was different. Quiet evenings were spent digging through every page of the HOA bylaws. Paragraph by paragraph, clause by clause, the document revealed secrets that most had never taken the time to uncover. Hidden among the legal jargon were contradictions, loopholes, and restrictions that limited the board's authority more than they ever admitted. The fines, for instance, were subject to strict procedures the HOA had completely ignored. Their letters had bypassed the necessary warnings, skipped mandatory hearings, and applied penalties far beyond what the bylaws actually permitted. It was a house of cards, one that looked intimidating from the outside but could crumble with the right push. Instead of bowing to the pressure, the homeowner began to build a case. Every letter was carefully filed. Every interaction with the board was documented. Screenshots, photos, and even witness accounts from supportive neighbors became part of a growing arsenal. With each passing day, the HOA believed their intimidation was working, unaware that they were feeding the very evidence that would later be used against them. The board members continued their campaign, showing up unannounced, snapping photos of the property, and leaving passive-aggressive notes at the door. Their arrogance blinded them to the quiet determination of the homeowner, who never argued back, never raised their voice, but instead prepared for the inevitable clash. By the end of the month, the supposed debt had ballooned into tens of thousands of dollars. To the board, it was a victory. To the homeowner, it was the final confirmation that the time to act had arrived. The calm before the storm was over. The game had shifted. The HOA thought they were tightening their grip, but in reality, They were walking straight into a trap that had been set with patience and precision. And when the first counterstrike landed, it would shake the entire neighborhood. The HOA board gathered for their monthly meeting, smug and satisfied with themselves. They believed they had cornered yet another resident into submission. To them, it was only a matter of time before the homeowner gave in and paid the inflated fines, just like everyone else before. But while the board congratulated themselves in whispers and exchanged knowing glances, a very different kind of preparation was taking place behind closed doors at the homeowner's desk. Stacks of papers, binders, and highlighted pages of the HOA bylaws covered the dining room table. The homeowner had become fluent in the language of rules and regulations, deciphering clauses that the board either did not understand or deliberately ignored. There it was, in black and white. Fines could not exceed a small daily cap. Warnings had to be issued in multiple stages, and hearings with impartial oversight were mandatory before penalties were allowed to stand. The HOA had skipped every one of these steps. What they called debt was nothing more than a bluff. The homeowner drafted a formal response, not a heated letter of complaint, but a carefully worded document citing specific sections of the bylaws and state law. Every violation by the HOA WWO, as listed in detail. Their failure to notify properly, their unlawful escalation of fines, and their harassment tactics that included unannounced visits and intimidating notes. It was not the voice of a desperate resident, but the cold, factual tone of someone who knew the rules better than the rule makers themselves. Copies of the letter were sent not only to the HOA but also to the property management company that oversaw the neighborhood and, most importantly, to the county office responsible for housing regulations. The board's private theater of intimidation was suddenly dragged into the light of official scrutiny. At first, the HOA dismissed the response. They laughed at it, brushing it aside as the last attempt of a homeowner too stubborn to surrender. They continued to issue their daily fines, updating their records with astronomical numbers that bore no legal weight. But cracks began to form. The property manager forwarded the homeowner's letter back to the board with questions of their own, warning that the county had already opened an inquiry. Meanwhile, the homeowner wasn't finished. Armed with months of careful documentation, they filed a formal complaint with the state's housing authority. The complaint was thick with evidence. Photographs of the shed showing it posed no disruption, copies of every threatening letter, logs of every unwanted visit, and a timeline that exposed the board's blatant disregard for procedure. To strengthen the case, statements from sympathetic neighbors were included, each one describing their own negative experiences with the HOA. The state required time to review the matter, but the mere existence of the complaint sent a ripple of unease through the board. Suddenly, their unchecked power no longer seemed so secure. The smugness began to fade, replaced with whispers of doubt. Still, they pushed forward, desperate to prove they remained in control. One afternoon, a bold notice was taped to the homeowner's front door, declaring that foreclosure proceedings would begin if the fines were not paid in full. To them, this was the ultimate weapon, the final act of intimidation that no one could resist. But once again, they had overplayed their hand. The homeowner had already discovered in the bylaws that foreclosure was not only prohibited for unpaid fines, but explicitly illegal under state law. That notice was more than just an empty threat. It was evidence of fraud. Another report was filed, this time with the Attorney General's office, elevating the conflict from a neighborhood squabble to a legal battle with potential consequences for the entire board. As weeks passed, neighbors began to notice a shift in the balance of power. Where once the HOA walked confidently, barking orders and issuing threats, they now moved with hesitation. Their letters became less aggressive, their visits less frequent. Behind closed doors, panic spread among board members. They had thought themselves untouchable, but one homeowner had flipped their own rule book against them. And the storm was only beginning. With investigations underway, the homeowner prepared the next stage of the counterattack, a lawsuit that would not only erase every bogus fine, but also hold the HOA financially responsible for harassment, emotional distress, and the unlawful misuse of power. The same board that had once laughed at their defiance now faced a very real threat. Exposure, accountability, and the possibility of losing everything they had built their false authority upon. The trap was closing, and this time the HOA couldn't laugh their way out. The neighborhood had grown quiet, but not in the peaceful way it once had been. Instead, there was a tense silence that hung over every conversation, every glance exchanged on the sidewalks. Word had spread that the homeowner had taken the HOA to court, and whispers drifted between neighbors about what might happen next. Some were curious, others fearful, and a few quietly thrilled at the prospect of seeing the board finally held accountable. For the HOA, the lawsuit was more than just an inconvenience. It was a direct assault on the foundation of their power. For years, they had relied on fear and intimidation to enforce compliance, believing that no homeowner would ever dare to challenge them in a court of law. Now, with formal charges filed, their arrogance turned into dread. The homeowner's lawsuit was not hastily thrown together. It was precise, sharp, and meticulously backed with evidence. Every letter of harassment, every unlawful fine, every baseless threat was organized into a timeline that revealed a pattern of abuse. The demand was simple: dismissal of all fines, financial compensation for damages, and accountability for the board's misconduct. At the first hearing, the board attempted to posture. They arrived in suits, trying to project authority, waving thick binders of their own. They expected to intimidate the judge just as they had intimidated the neighborhood. But once the proceedings began, their confidence quickly crumbled. The judge's questions were relentless. Where were the documented warnings required by the bylaws? Where were the records of the mandatory hearings? Why had the fines exceeded the limits allowed by law? The board had no answers. Their carefully constructed facade began to collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence. Each time they tried to justify their actions, the homeowner's attorney countered with precise references from the bylaws and state law, showing that the HOA had violated not just community rules, but the law itself. The case grew stronger with every detail. Witness statements from neighbors painted a damning picture of a board that ruled through fear. Several residents testified about their own experiences, being fined for trivial matters, receiving threatening letters, and feeling powerless to resist. What had once been private grumblings behind closed doors was now spoken aloud in the courtroom, echoing off the walls for all to hear. The board tried to argue that the shed truly disrupted the neighborhood's appearance, but photographs told a different story. Images of the neat, well-kept structure, hidden behind hedges, contrasted sharply with other properties where sheds, playhouses, and even large trampolines stood in plain sight without issue. The selective enforcement was undeniable. As the hearings dragged on, the pressure on the board intensified. Their legal fees mounted, draining the very funds they had hoarded from residents' dues. For the first time, their unchecked authority was costing them dearly. Behind closed doors, they argued among themselves, blaming one another for the escalating disaster. The homeowner, meanwhile, remained steady. They did not gloat, did not lash out, but simply allowed the truth to speak for itself. The satisfaction came not from vengeance, but from the slow, steady unraveling of a system built on intimidation. Outside the courtroom, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet anticipation. Some residents offered kind words in passing, emboldened by the courage they had witnessed. Others simply watched from a distance, waiting to see how far the battle would go. The turning point came when the judge ordered a temporary halt to all HOA fines across the community until the case reached a conclusion. It was a ruling that shook the entire neighborhood. Suddenly, every homeowner realized that the board's power was not absolute. that their rules could be challenged and overturned. The board panicked. Their once iron grip over the residents slipped through their fingers. They attempted desperate measures, private meetings, new letters sent to the community painting the homeowner as a troublemaker, and whispered campaigns to discredit them. But it was too late. The truth was out, and no smear campaign could cover the evidence already lay in court. The lawsuit marched forward, each day bringing the board closer to a verdict that could dismantle their authority entirely. For the homeowner, it was not just about protecting a shed anymore. It was about exposing a system that thrived on fear and replacing it with fairness. And as the case neared its climax, the stakes grew higher. What had started as one person's battle over a shed was quickly turning into a fight for the freedom of an entire neighborhood. The board thought they were untouchable. Soon, they would discover just how wrong they were. The HOA board once carried themselves like kings and queens of the neighborhood, strutting through community meetings with smug smiles and wagging fingers. But as the lawsuit dragged on, their crowns began to slip. What was once quiet confidence had turned into visible strain. Their polished appearances gave way to nervous frowns, their firm voices cracked under questioning, and their united front fractured as internal blame consumed them. Behind closed doors, the boardroom was no longer a place of authority, but of chaos. Accusations flew across the table. One member blamed the president for pushing the aggressive fines without proper procedure. Another argued that the treasurer had mismanaged funds, leaving them with little to cover mounting legal expenses. Others whispered about resigning altogether, unwilling to go down with the sinking ship. What had once been a coalition bound by arrogance had crumbled into a battlefield of self-preservation. Meanwhile, the homeowner's case only grew stronger. Investigators from the State Housing Authority released a preliminary report, confirming what the homeowner had argued all along. The HOA had acted outside its authority. The fines were unlawful, the foreclosure threats were fraudulent, and the board's pattern of selective enforcement revealed favoritism and abuse. Of power. The report spread like wildfire. Neighbors passed copies to one another, reading the words that validated years of quiet resentment. Suddenly, the board's aura of invincibility was shattered. Residents who once cowered at their threats now spoke openly about their own grievances. Stories surfaced of arbitrary fines, intimidation tactics, and petty harassment. The board's reputation collapsed under the weight of its own history. The homeowner remained patient, watching the tide turn. Each day brought more evidence, more support, and more cracks in the board's crumbling walls. The courtroom hearings had become a stage where the board's hypocrisy was laid bare, and the audience, the neighbors, took note of every stumble, every contradiction, every desperate attempt to twist the truth. The financial strain became unbearable for the HOA. Legal bills piled higher than the phony fines they once demanded from residents. Their reserves dwindled, leaving them unable to fund routine maintenance in the community. The once pristine common areas began to show signs of neglect, lawns overgrown, fountains dry, and paint peeling from the clubhouse. The very image they claimed to protect was decaying, a visible reflection of their internal collapse. Desperation drove the board to make mistakes. In one reckless move, they sent a community-wide letter blaming the homeowner for the association's financial woes, portraying them as a villain who was draining resources. But instead of turning the neighborhood against the homeowner, the letter had the opposite effect. Residents laughed at the absurdity, knowing full well that the board's reckless behavior had brought them to ruin. Support for the homeowner swelled. Neighbors who had once remained silent now voiced their gratitude, some even offering to testify if needed. The board's circle of influence had shrunk to nothing. Where once their word was law, now it was met with skepticism, ridicule, and outright defiance. As the final trial date approached, the atmosphere was electric. The board shuffled nervously into the courtroom, visibly worn down by the relentless pressure. The homeowner, calm and collected, carried the same binder of evidence that had been meticulously built from the start. The contrast was stark. Arrogance versus discipline, intimidation versus truth. The judge listened carefully as closing arguments were made. The homeowner's attorney presented a clear narrative: a board that abused its power, harassed residents, and acted unlawfully at every turn. The board's attorney stumbled through excuses, offering vague explanations and hollow justifications. The room knew it. The verdict was inevitable. And yet, the most devastating blow had not yet fallen. The homeowner had one final card to play, a piece of evidence that would not just secure victory but expose the board in a way they could never recover from. The reveal would come soon, and when it did, the last remnants of the HOA's power would crumble into dust. The courtroom was thick with tension as the final day of the trial began. Every seat was filled, not only with curious neighbors but with reporters who had caught wind of the extraordinary case. The board sat stiffly in their chairs, pale and uneasy, their once confident posture reduced to slouched defeat. The homeowner, however, appeared calm, collected, and prepared for the moment that would define the entire battle. The board's attorney went first, delivering a tired speech about the importance of maintaining community standards and portraying the fines as a necessary deterrent. But the words rang hollow. Even the judge's expression revealed skepticism, as if listening to a story already disproven by the mountain of evidence presented in previous sessions. Then it was the homeowner's turn. Their attorney stood and began with a steady, deliberate rhythm, weaving together months of testimony, documents, and reports. The unlawful fines, the skipped procedures, the harassment, each point hammered another nail into the coffin of the HOA's credibility. The judge listened intently, nodding at times, taking notes at others. Finally, the attorney paused, and the homeowner produced one last binder from beneath the table. Inside was the evidence they had been saving for this very moment, financial records obtained through discovery. These records revealed that the board had not only imposed unlawful fines, but had misused association funds to cover personal expenses. Meals at expensive restaurants, luxury items, and even a vacation had been disguised as community expenditures. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Neighbors whispered fiercely among themselves, their suspicions now confirmed. The HOA board, already on trial for harassment and unlawful fines, now stood exposed as corrupt stewards of community money. The judge's demeanor changed instantly. What had been a case about one homeowner's shed had transformed into a revelation of financial misconduct affecting every resident in the neighborhood. The board's attorney scrambled, flipping through papers, stammering weak denials. But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable, the numbers clear, and the narrative devastating. In that moment, the board's final defense crumbled. They were no longer the enforcers of order, but the perpetrators of theft, caught red-handed in front of the very people they had lorded over for years. The verdict came swiftly. All fines against the homeowner were declared null and void. The HOA was ordered to pay restitution for harassment and emotional distress, with additional penalties for their unlawful threats of foreclosure. But the most crushing blow came in the form of personal accountability. The judge ruled that individual board members could be held liable for financial mismanagement, opening the door for criminal investigations. The courtroom erupted. Some neighbors cheered, others sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. For years they had suffered under the board's arrogance, but now, with one decisive strike, the system had collapsed. The very people who had demanded obedience were now exposed as frauds, facing not just embarrassment, but potential legal consequences of their own. The homeowner walked out of the courthouse without a word, but the look on their face spoke volumes. It wasn't pride, nor was it gloating. It was relief, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served and that no one in the neighborhood would ever again be forced to endure the same abuse. The board, on the other hand, shuffled out like ghosts. Their empire of intimidation had fallen in a single day, and the weight of their downfall hung heavy in the air. The homeowners they once ruled over with fear now looked at them with contempt, no longer subjects but equals who had witnessed their corruption firsthand. But while the verdict was delivered, the story wasn't over. There remained the matter of rebuilding the neighborhood, of reshaping the association into something that truly served the community rather than controlled it. And as the dust settled, eyes turned to the homeowner, the one who had dared to fight back, to see what role they would play in shaping the future. The final chapter of this saga was about to begin. The neighborhood was never the same after the trial. The verdict had sent shockwaves through every street, every household, every quiet conversation at the mailbox. For years, residents had accepted the HOA's authority as untouchable, believing their only choice was to obey or leave. But the collapse of the board proved otherwise. The fear was gone, and in its place was something new: unity. The corrupt board members resigned in disgrace, their reputations shattered, their influence gone. Some moved away quietly, unable to face the glares of the very neighbors they had once intimidated. Others stayed but lived in silence, their days of power reduced to bitter memories. Investigations into their financial misconduct loomed, leaving them with the burden of legal consequences far heavier than any fine they had ever imposed. For the first time in years, the community was free. But freedom required rebuilding. The HOA, stripped of its abusive leadership, had to be reshaped into something fair and functional. A meeting was called, not in the stuffy clubhouse where the old board had ruled with arrogance, but in the open air of the neighborhood park. Dozens of residents came, some nervous, others excited, all determined to ensure the mistakes of the past would never repeat. The homeowner, who had once stood alone against the board, now stood among allies. Neighbors who had once stayed silent offered thanks, acknowledging that the courage of one had sparked change for all. Many encouraged the homeowner to run for the new board, to lead the community into its next chapter. At first, they resisted, wary of the responsibility. But eventually, they agreed, not out of desire for power, but out of a commitment to fairness. Under the new leadership, the HOA transformed. Rules were simplified, fines strictly regulated, and transparency became the standard. Meetings were open and honest, with decisions made by consensus rather than decree. Community funds were used for visible improvements, repairing sidewalks, planting trees, upgrading playgrounds, things that genuinely benefited residents instead of padding the egos of a select few. The shed that had sparked the entire conflict still stood quietly in the backyard, unchanged, a simple structure that now symbolized far more than its wood and nails. It had become a monument to resilience, proof that one act of defiance could topple years of unchecked authority. In time, the neighborhood thrived. Children played freely in the park without fear of complaints. Families decorated their homes for the holidays without worrying about fines. And residents who hence avoided one another out of fear of being reported now came together for block parties, barbecues, and shared laughter. The homeowner often reflected on the journey. What had started as a battle over a shed had become a war for justice, one that exposed corruption, reshaped a community, and proved that even the most intimidating institutions could be defeated when confronted with truth and persistence. The HOA had once tried to fine them $500 a day, believing they could break their will. Instead, it was the board that had been broken, and from its ruins, something better had risen. The story was no longer about fines or rules, or even revenge. It was about reclaiming freedom, dignity, and the right to live peacefully in one's own home. And in the quiet of a summer evening, as the homeowner sat on the porch watching neighbors walk by with smiles instead of fear, it was clear that the fight had been worth every moment. A new beginning had arrived, and this time, The community belonged to everyone, not just those who once thought they ruled it.